preached a fire and brimstone kind of sermon, but at least according to Hudson, they all preached the doctrine of divine grace, of justification by faith, based on individuals committing their lives to Christ. This is the early American, your predecessors in our great country. Maclay observes that this emphasis on individual conversion was totally consonant with the American focus on individual worth and natural rights from God, rather than rights from the hand of government. Now, historians love to have fights about little things that don't really matter. And I'm going to point out three. One of them is, well, did this religious influence cause the revolution? Well, there is a school of thought that basically says, yeah. And in fact, John Adams wrote a letter, I think in the 1820s or 30s, I'll quote from it, that gives these historians some basis for the argument. I'll quote his letter. He said, "The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations." He wrote that Americans came to see the king as renouncing the laws and constitution derived to them from the God of nature. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real revolution. Well, James Hudson disagrees that religion caused the revolution, but he says this, and I quote, "Although religion did not directly cause the revolution against Britain, it offered powerful support to the American cause at every step of the way." And there are a lot of different examples that he cites in his book. Some of them are a little bit humorous to me. Anglicans were generally split on whether we should go to war with England. But one of the Anglicans preached, for example, that, and I'm quoting, "resistance to a tyrant was a glorious Christian duty." So he supported the revolution. Jonathan Mayhew was his name. A Presbyterian minister by the name of Abraham Cateltus preached the revolution is the cause of heaven against hell. So if you're sitting in the pew and that's what your preacher is telling you, you're going to get behind the cause. And Hudson concludes, without assuring Americans that the resistance movement was right in God's sight and had his blessing, it could not have been sustained and independence could not have been achieved. So it may not have been caused by, but it was certainly influenced. And Hudson summarized it this way. He said, "There can be no doubt, none whatever, that religion was the salt that flavored life in the 17th century British North America." Now that's all of the people. And think about what they read. They read the Bible if they could read, and if they couldn't read, they still had it memorized. This was the most popular book. They attended church. They believed what we believe, and they were coming in more and more numbers. Now, I said historians love to argue. I'm going to digress for just a moment to discuss two other debates among historians, neither of which I believe detract from the very strong historical record of the influence of religion on America's founding. But I think they're interesting. The first is the assertion that the founders were more influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy of natural law than by religion. And this argument, I think, is misplaced for several reasons. First, they were influenced by both, no question. But the reality is there's very little difference between natural law and religion, the Christian faith. Each was influenced by the other, and they mean essentially the same thing. Mankind in its natural state has inherent worth, freedom, and rights that should be respected. Whether called human rights derived from natural law or God-given rights, they amount to the same thing. And under either description, they should be preserved and protected. Moreover, the secular philosophers of the 18th century, people like John Locke, did not discount religious notions in the formulation of their own natural rights philosophy. Tim Keller, who I'll further introduce in a moment, has written that the concept of human rights was found in Christian jurisprudence in the 12th and 13th centuries, quoting, "rooted particularly in the Christian doctrine that all human beings are created in the image of God and therefore have inherent dignity." natural law philosophers were obviously well aware of all of this. In addition, thinking people can believe in two consistent things simultaneously. Thus, while it's true the founders were very well read in Enlightenment works, and in particular John Locke, they were also religious and undoubtedly anchored their belief in human rights in biblical teachings with which they were very familiar, beginning with Genesis. Both Christianity and Enlightenment philosophy are centered on the individual. Both teach that all mankind, have inherent value. In the case of Judeo-Christian faith, it's because we were created by God, and that makes us very, very special. When Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he was expressing both a religious and a secular belief in the rights of man. Both were self-evident. They needed no further proof. In fact, he wrote many years later that when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he didn't intend to create any new philosophy, to invent anything. He said, all I wanted to do was to express the sentiments of the American people. So this is why it was self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The American people didn't need any further proof of this, and Jefferson knew that they believed it in their heart. So to me, the historical disagreement, while it's very interesting, doesn't detract from, let alone disprove, the strong influence of religion on our founding. The second debate is even less consequential. It's the claim that because many of the founders were deists rather than traditional Christians, that the claim of influence fails. That's a non sequitur. Deists believed in God, but not the true divinity of Christ, to greatly oversimplify it. To this argument, I think the simplest answer is, well, even if it's true, so what? Thomas Jefferson became more religious after he became president, but he clearly believed in God when he authored the Declaration. There he asserted it self-evident that we are endowed by God, he used the common term creator, our creator, with rights to freedom and life itself. Whether or not Jefferson was a deist at the time, the important point is that he believed in and he expressed these rights as God-given. Whether he also believed that Jesus performed miracles is really irrelevant to the question of whether his religious beliefs influenced his writings and views on the founding. He believed in God the Creator, in nature's God, the supreme judge, and divine providence. Those are the four terms he used in the Declaration of Independence to refer to God. Now there are some other points. I mentioned Jefferson, at least as of the time he was president, was clearly a Christian and a very strong churchgoer. Not so much before he became president, but once he was president, maybe because of the fact that it looked good, I don't know, but he was a very strong, and he allowed the government buildings to be used as places of worship. They worshiped in the chamber of the House of Representatives in the Capitol. This wasn't exactly a big separation of religion and government. He believed that government should stay out of church affairs. That was his wall of separation. Government isn't going to get involved in religion and tell you what to do. But that's what he meant by the wall of separation. By the way, Hudson's book has a couple of interesting exhibits. They actually sent Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, which is the letter that contained the phrase separation, the wall of separation between church and state. They sent it to the FBI. And they said, could you tell us what he scratched out? Because, back in those days, they didn't have erasers. They just took their ink, their quill, and they scratched stuff out. And so the FBI took a look at it, and they were able to figure out what he had scratched out and what he wrote in the margin. And Hudson concludes, it's pretty clear. Jefferson was playing a little politics with the Baptists here. He didn't want them to think that government was going to interfere with their church. The Baptists were the folks that were kind of 2 steps away from government. They didn't trust government. And so Jefferson was trying to assure them, hey, there's a wall of separation between government and your church. Don't worry about it. But that came to mean something very different later on when the Supreme Court started fooling around with the phrase. In any event, You can find numerous writings, speeches, and letters, all that confirm the strong influence of religion on the founders. So, does it make a difference whether this influence existed? And does it make a difference that our rights as Americans came from God, as Jefferson said? Well, let's start with what the Bible says. Good place to start, at the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now think about that. Image of God. If you are anything like God, you are really special. You must have sacred aspects to your very being, and that's what we believe. That has profound implications on how we deal with each other and how our government should deal with us, doesn't it? Tim Keller, who I said I would introduce more, many of you know who Tim Keller is. He's the minister of the very large Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. And he's written several books, one of which is called Generous Justice. And he addresses what it means to be created in the image of God. He says, the Bible teaches that the sacredness of God has in some ways been imparted to humanity, so that every human life is sacred and every human being has dignity. When God put his image on us, we became beings of infinite, inestimable value. He further wrote, the image of God carries with it the right not to be mistreated. And he notes that the doctrine of the image of God is at the heart of the civil rights movement. And he quoted Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm going to quote his quote of Martin Luther King Jr. He said this, you see, the founding fathers were really influenced by the Bible. The whole concept of the imago Dei, as expressed in Latin, the image of God, is the idea that all men have something within them that God injected. Not only that they have a substantial unity with God, but that every man has a capacity to have fellowship with God. And this gives him worth, it gives him dignity, and we must never forget this as a nation. Now, part of our beliefs as Christians is that we should always take seriously our obligation to be good stewards of God's gifts to us. You see where I'm going with this? If God gave us these rights, and if he made us in his image, there's an implied obligation that we better take care of these rights and this condition of ours. We need to preserve it and to protect it and to ensure that other people are not mistreated and that our rights are not taken away from us by anyone, including a government. And by the way, you know, we think of the gifts of time and treasure and talent and say we need to return these to God's greater glory, which is true. I would say that goes double for life and liberty. So would anyone deny that God can't be restrained in any way? That he has ultimate liberty in life? I think that's pretty clear. If we're all imbued with his sacred dignity, that means that our rights must be protected too. And I believe it's one of our obligations both as Christians and, as MLK Jr. suggested in his comment, as citizens of the United States. Well, how so? This brings us to the second great idea in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson asserts that government are constituted among men, and the government governs with the consent of the governed. This is the great notion in America. We are self-governing, and our representatives are totally accountable to us. That's why they're called public servants. That's the central principle of our government, self-governance. And this is the foundation of sovereignty of the people. It is a key natural rights precept. America was really the first time that this natural rights idea of a social compact among the people was attempted on the scale that it was. It had been tried in Greece, for example, we know, but this was the first large-scale example of it. And you remember I referred earlier to the compacts, the idea that there is a connection between the government that they're going to create and the ideas of religion that would inform that government. Well, in the next lecture, next week from Tuesday, I'm going to further develop this idea as it pertains to the Constitution of the United States. So I'm only going to touch today on just a brief overview of it, but I ask you to remember that the idea that the founders had about the nature of people, human nature, much of that came from the Bible and the stories based in the Bible. It was based on their approach to human nature through the ages and also in their own time. And it starts with their awareness of the biblical injunction that we're all fallen men, prone to error and sin. Because they recognized man's propensity for greed, power, and the great capacity to hurt others, they strove to create a governing structure that would minimize these possibilities for harm. That was their theory of government. And they did it first by designing a structure. Think of the structure of a government as kind of like the skeleton. The structure of the federal government that consisted of several power centers that they assumed would jealously work to protect their own jurisdiction, even as they might try to encroach on each other. The first division of power was between the states and the federal government. That we refer to that as federalism. And their assumption was that the states, which effectively had been the only government in the colonies, the only real government before 1787, that the states would continue to assert their inherent powers and thus act to foil any attempt of the federal government to acquire too much power. Federal powers were carefully delineated in the new Constitution, and powers not expressly delegated to the federal government had become, were reserved to the states and to the people. As we know, the federal government has become a lot more powerful today than I think the founders ever anticipated, but that's a subject for another time. Some of the current fighting, by the way, between states and the federal government, you hear about it in the news every now and then, shows how this tension is supposed to work between the two governments. And I call this federalism the vertical axis of how the founders wanted to divide power. There's a horizontal axis as well within the federal government itself, how to disperse powers within the national government. And at least for those of you who are over 50, you learned in school that our government is divided into three separate branches, and the first is the legislative, and it is itself divided between the House of Representatives and the Senate. All three branches and the two separate houses have different, though overlapping, powers. Again, the idea was to diffuse power so that no one branch or person or group could acquire too much power. The assumption again was that each of these power centers would fight to preserve their prerogatives, the natural human tendency. The separation of powers would, it was hoped, result in a balance of sorts. The three branches are not equal, but they each have specified rights and obligations, and if one gets too assertive, there are ways that the other branches can fight back. Again, I'm going to go into more detail into this in the next session, but you get the idea that I'm trying to portray here. And I think you would agree that our system has worked reasonably well for 230 years, even though we have some specific complaints these days. Again, we'll talk more about that. But one thing I'll bet you didn't learn in school is that there is a second, equally important idea of the founders besides federalism and the separation of powers to ensure good government. They created the skeleton, the structure, but they also didn't forget the heart. In order for self-government to work, the founders believed that both the people and their representatives in government had to exercise civic virtue, that is, to be willing to make decisions for the good of the whole rather than for individual factions. They were very afraid of factions. One might call them special interests or even political parties. The founders were concerned about the public's well-being over and above their own personal interests. And they thought these factions might try to promote policies for their own benefit to the exclusion of the good of the whole. To ensure this didn't happen, they believed that the solid values of George Washington should be the standard for debate and negotiation and development of consensus and policy in the new government. Jefferson added to this the necessity of education for a self-governing people, and you can understand why he did that. Now, the founders were under no illusion that everyone was committed to these values, but because moral behavior was based on religion, and the majority of Americans were very religious, they had reason to hope that a sufficient level of civic virtue would exist to promote good self-rule. And historian Will Maclay put it this way in this book: everything depended upon the virtuous character of the citizenry, of their willingness to live as George Washington had done and place the public's well-being over and above their own personal interests. But his final sentence says, such civic virtue was exceedingly rare and hard to sustain in the whole society. And yet, and I guess I would say so it is, but the founders themselves demonstrated the ability to exercise this kind of civic virtue, and the history of the Constitutional Convention, I think, is a great example of it, and the effort to obtain ratification of the Constitution by the states thereafter. Hamilton and Jefferson, for different reasons, were on the same side of the central debate between the large states and the small states. They fought very hard, and they were both very influential, Madison in particular. They lost that debate. This is one of the most central debates about the founding of the country, and they lost, and that wasn't the only debate they lost. But when it was all done, they signed on, and when ratification was hanging by a thread in their two states of New York and Virginia, they got together with John Jay and wrote the Federalist Papers, which were basically a series of 80-some articles that were published in the newspapers of the day arguing for ratification of the Constitution. They assimilated all of the good arguments why you should ratify this Constitution. And they had lost the major battles. So they understood that even though they didn't get their way, that it was more important that this Constitution be ratified and that we move on than for them to continue to be concerned about the fights that they had lost. So they demonstrated the ability to debate fiercely, but arrive at compromises, and they thought likewise that the American people were capable of ruling themselves. As I noted earlier, one reason was because of the religious character of the vast majority of the American people. Civic virtue was based on morality, which was in turn based on religion. And here we come full circle to people governing themselves based upon their strong religious convictions. James Hudson cites several examples in his book. He quotes a Vermont group which wrote in 1830, "No republican form of government can long exist in its original purity without virtue and intelligence in the body politic, and the principles and practice of Christian religion are the most effectual means of promoting and preserving that virtue and intelligence." Even the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts in 1780 said this. It provides that the religion of the gospel is the rock on which civil liberty rests. Amen to that. So Hudson refers to the founders' conviction that religion was necessary for the preservation of republican government. And he adds the founders believed not only in religion, but revivals of religion were necessary for the preservation of republican government. Now, as we look at our government today, it's not hard to conclude that a lot of the problems are a result of bad attitudes and unwillingness of one side to listen to the other side's viewpoints and to compromise, and maybe because there are more special pleaders than there are people who are looking out for the good of the whole. In short, there's a shortage of civic virtue. And looking in the mirror, it could be a problem for both our representatives and we the people. I believe the founders were correct that civic virtue is a necessity to self-government. But they may have overestimated the American people's commitment to civic virtue. That may be because they could not foresee the decline of religiosity in America. There are a lot of public opinion surveys which test America's religious practices, and they all show that the influence of the church has declined. In our own Presbyterian denomination, for example, membership has declined in just a few decades from over 5 million to just a little over 1 million. Now, some believe that morality and altruism can exist without religion. And maybe so for some people, for some time. But over the long term, I can't conceive of an entire country long surviving without the influence of religion on most of its people, especially a country that relies upon the people to govern themselves. Our form of government has lasted longer than any other people's experiment in self-government. But is it doomed because of the character of the American people? I'd like to think not. But the answer may lie in the ability of Christians to revive the religion that once dominated among our people. If we believe God granted life and liberty, and as good stewards of His gifts, we must defend those rights. We should do so both as Christians and as engaged citizens in our self-government. This is our Christian calling, and it is our citizenship challenge. I'm going to close with a specific example of how we can, and I believe should, fulfill this dual responsibility. We've just seen how from the very beginning of America, the people who settled here and those who came after them believed religion was central to the success of their society and government. Civic virtue based on religious principles and values was considered essential to self-government. So why is it today that many people argue that religious views have no place in public debates? Those of us who disagree with that are canceled. We're shut out of the debate because our views are deemed impermissible. One answer is because, this is my opinion, secularists are frequently irreligious themselves and are uncomfortable debating believers. Another view is that only so-called rational arguments are allowed in political discussions, and arguments based on religious teaching can't be rational by definition. Well, those who believe this cannot conceive of religion as a legitimate worldview. They fear its influence and therefore actually wish its destruction as a competitor to their worldview. You hear, therefore, that your freedom of religion extends no further than the confines of your own home. You can pray all you want to in your own home. Just don't bring your religious views out into the public square. You've got to leave your religion behind, and not only that, but any positions you hold that might be based on your religious teachings, such as how you think about morality or gender or the sanctity of life, or any other question of public debate. Applying lessons of life that we have learned as Christians to our everyday life, including social and political issues, is natural to us. Those lessons are a part of who we are. They are the foundations of our worldview, our general approach to life's problems and issues. And of course, we're going to think about those things as we debate public issues. We can no more jettison those views from our thinking and discussing than we can keep our feet from moving when we walk. So, and I would also argue from a moral perspective, we shouldn't have to. Our worldview is certainly no less respectable than the purely secular worldview. Indeed, I can argue that a religious-influenced view is richer, more historically based, and more rooted in rational philosophy than the secularist alternative. In any event, my view is not demonstrably inferior. So no one should have the right to tell me my views are impermissible in the public debate. I readily admit I might be wrong on a particular issue. I've been wrong a lot. But my Christian worldview is a legitimate basis for some of my opinions, and yours. So my point is that as Christians, we must defend our faith and the ideas and consequences that flow from our faith. Some of you have read Chuck Colson's books on his prison ministries. And he writes about this challenge to Christians. He says we can't always pick our battles. Sometimes we have to respond to challenges where they confront us, even though it is inconvenient or uncomfortable. We didn't choose this battle. Nonetheless, it chose us. And we have to figure out how to respond. And that includes in the public square. Another author, a professor of philosophy at USC by the name of Brendan Sweetman, wrote a book called Why Politics Needs Religion, the Place of Religious Arguments in the Public Square. And he explains that there are both religious and secular worldviews upon which people base their approach to life and issues, including politics. He believes, as do I, and I'm quoting here, that the general religious view of the world is reasonable, that many of the more basic foundational beliefs associated with religious belief are reasonable and can play a role in public, political, and social debate. In fact, he writes, I believe the religious worldview provides the best justification of the scheme of rights and values, that religious belief is more rational than secularism. Well, I agree with that. But I don't contend that secular arguments are illegitimate and shouldn't be heard. So if the question is whether arguments based on, at least in part, on religious teachings are a point of view worth hearing in public debate, I say the answer is obviously yes. And one place to look for that answer is in the beliefs of the founders. Did they leave their religion behind in their writings and in their speeches and what they created in our government? No, it was a part of it. We've already seen how they incorporated religious teachings and values into the fabric of America, including government. God gave us the ability to discern truth based on His teaching and our reason. As good stewards of His gifts, we certainly have the right and duty to use those gifts to His greater glory. And I venture that as the true owners of our governments, the policies established based on free and open debate will also be good for America. Now, rebuttals, questions, all you, thank you. Just go to the center aisle where there's a microphone. That way everybody can hear your question. Or, as I say, if you have a different point of view and you'd like to engage in a civil debate about it, I'm all for that. So please, don't be bashful. I knew Roy Miller would take the microphone. That's fine.
I'm wondering if you think that the Bible or Christianity in general has any instruction on the particular structure of government.
Only, the question is, does the Bible speak to the actual structure of government that our founders created here in any way? And David Joint would have a lot better answer to this, but I think the only thing that I can think of is this. Throughout the Bible, there are inferences and in some cases actual teachings about how we should use the free will that God gives us to make the right decisions. He doesn't impose his requirement that we love Him. That isn't the way it works. He doesn't want to say, you have to love me. He's hoping that the free will that He gives us and the other teachings through Jesus will lead us to that result. And in this sense, I think there's an idea of that is similar to the idea of self-governance. We have the ability to think these things through, use some of His teachings, and govern ourselves. And all of the lessons about how you should treat other people come into play here. That's what civic virtue is all about. Think about other people too. I'll share with you a little something that I've come to realize. When I first went to Congress, boy, I was going to reform the world, and my philosophy was the only one. And that's what a lot of people in Washington believe today. But after I'd been a senator for a while and I represented all of the people of the state of Arizona, and in fact, U.S. senators, to some extent, represent all of America in a way. Certainly when we go abroad, we do. But you begin to think about the 40% or so of the people who really don't like you, and they don't like what you stand for. But you got elected. So here are John McCain and me, we're both Republicans, pretty conservative, and we usually vote with the Republican side. And so the 40% of the people in Arizona, or in a couple of cases a little bit more than that, who didn't vote for me, they're aced out. Now, that's the way it works in the House of Representatives. If you're in the minority in the House, you don't count. You might as well be a potted plant. That's the rule of the majority plus one, pure majoritarian rule. Majority wins. If you are 49 instead of 51, you're out of luck on everything, on 100% of the stuff. In the Senate, on the other hand, the minority has rights. By the way, the filibuster is a big part of one of those rights. And the theory, it takes 60 senators to override a filibuster. But the idea is 40 out of 100 is a pretty big minority. 40 out of 100 deserve to be listened to. And they should have a little bit of power to force the majority to listen to them. And I finally realized if I'm going to represent all the people of Arizona, even though I don't agree with that 40% that didn't vote for me and that have a different point of view, I better try to appreciate that they should get something out of this deal. And so compromise, negotiation and compromise is not a bad word. And if you can get 80% of what you think you deserve and the other side gets 20%, that's not a bad bargain. And if it makes them happier, and all of the lawyers in this room know that you can do a commercial deal, for example, where you get 100% and the other side gets 0. Who's going to really win in that deal? In the long run, the guy that got 0 can't pay you, and so he goes bankrupt. Okay, who lost in that deal? He did, but you did too. You got to give the other side something out of the deal, and the legislation that results will last longer, it will have greater support, and it's more fair. Certainly, you can find a lesson in the Bible for all of those things. And so that might respond a little bit, Roy. But here's one last thing that I've thought of in the last few days. And this might make an interesting sermon sometime. Render under Caesar. The idea is that, look, nothing happens without, God has a plan for all of this. And if he allows a government to be created which rules over you, and that's the way it was back in the days of Jesus, that's part of his plan. And Jesus said, let it go. Render under Caesar what is Caesar's. If he says you got to pay these taxes, all right, you pay them. If he says you have to abide by this law, then do that, because that's all part of God's plan. But in America, we have a special little wrinkle on it that I think is really nifty. We are Caesar. See? This is self-government. This is do-it-yourself government in America. So we're the boss. We are Caesar. We are the government. And so when we say render under Caesar, we're really playing two roles here. And I think that's good. That's as it should be. And that's why I say there is both a secular obligation and a Christian obligation to be good stewards of God's gifts here. And as self-governing people, I think those two obligations merge. So I can't point to anything specifically, but I think a lot of these ideas at least bear on the subject.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I imagine most of the people in this room remember when Pogo famously said, "We have met the enemy,
Yep.
and he is
He's
us."
Yep.
Yep. 1 to you, 3 to me. So you're talking about we are Caesar. And most of what we're dealing with today is our gift to ourselves. What do? McClay's book, what is it, The Hope of the Land, or The Land of Hope? Where do you see hope in this group of Caesars that have gotten ourselves to where we are today?
Well, where do I see hope? One thing that McClay does is to confront directly some of the darker chapters in our history, slavery, for example. And he's got I think, a brilliant exposition of everything that happened, how people thought about it at the time. And I don't want to go into all of that tonight, though it's a great discussion to have, and maybe we should do it someday. But he also discusses several other times in our history, including the era of Jim Crow, related yet to slavery, where we had a problem and we confronted it, and eventually we solved it, more or less with the right solution. And he doesn't specifically preach this in his book, but I can readily conclude that a lot of the reasons that we solved those problems in the good way we did was because of our religious beliefs. Certainly the abolitionists at the time before the Civil War were, their views were very religiously motivated. And Martin Luther King Jr., one of the heroes of the civil rights movement, he used religious principles, as I quoted here, to make his case. So one answer to that is, if we can follow the great commandment and go out and influence other people by the way we act, we act out our religion, you know. As they say, always preach the gospel, and when necessary, use words when necessary. But if we can create another one of those great awakenings, a revival of the American spirit by the way we act and approach our neighbors, that's the way to do it. Now, do we have that capacity in this world, this secular world with all of the malign influences on us? It's tough. We still are going to do it. We're going to do our best. We're going to do that just because that's who we are and that's what we have to do. Whether it'll result in a good ending to the story or not is another question. I also believe that we need to teach our young people a lot better than we have in recent years about the principles of the government. And this is one of the things I'm going to talk about next week. I'll give you a preview. My point next week is this. Our system of government would work just fine if we had a little more civic virtue. There's nothing wrong with our system of government. Oh, it doesn't act quickly enough. Well, there was a reason for that. We can't immediately make things happen. That's right. The founders didn't want immediate action. They wanted to think it over and to try to develop a little broader consensus before you just do something. There are reasons for the complaints that we hear today, but when you get down to why those reasons are, I think you end up saying, on balance, they got it pretty right. And the only thing they might have missed on is they might have had a little too much confidence in the American people. So I can't totally answer the question, but McClay has hope, I have hope, you got to have hope, right? And as Christians, we do. So now let's hear from our scout.
So America's founded by Christianity. Why do so many people don't believe in it?
Why do some people not believe in our government, our country?
Yeah. Yeah, in Christian faith.
Yeah. Why do some people not believe in Christianity? David? I don't know. No, your question is a serious one, and it deserves a serious answer. There are a lot of influences in our society today that distract us from, for example, reading the Bible, that distract, you can watch a lot of football while Sunday services are going on. Next week, I will be at the championship NASCAR race. Shall I tell them where you were last year, David? There's so many distractions, and there are beliefs that a lot of people have that Christianity doesn't satisfy their view of how things should be. And so they don't want to accept the teachings of Jesus and the obligations of a Christian. It's not necessarily easy to be a Christian, as some of our ministers have been preaching to us in the last few Sundays. There were times, and in fact there are still places in the world today where Christians are persecuted very badly. So it's not necessarily easy. You have to give up your self-centeredness and your idea that you can make everything happen right. And you have to give that over to God, and you have to say, okay, God, I'm going to put myself in your hands. Well, That's a leap of faith. And some people are afraid to do that. And they also understand that if they do that, they'll probably have a little voice in their ear saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing that much of this, or all these bad things you're doing. We all do bad things. But once you turn your life to Christ, you're going to hear about that in the back of your mind. Wait a minute, you shouldn't be doing that. And some people don't want to hear that. They want to just keep on sinning. And let's call it what it is. So certainly Reverend Joyne and our other ministers know the answer to that. They deal with it every day. How can I bring people to believe in Jesus? How can I bring people to Christ? And there are a lot of challenges to that. But to me, the arguments are so overwhelming the other way that I have to have hope that a lot of people will become more religious. And as a result, they will be a little more willing to be reasonable when it comes to politics, to negotiate with each other, to listen to each other, and to compromise with each other. And if they do that, then I think the problems that we have today will largely be solved. But they'll have to have a little better attitude about it. You see it in school. I mean, sometimes you just have to have a fight. But then it feels really good when you can all sit around and agree on something too, doesn't it? Even though there are some of the people in your circle that are kind of disagreeable, or they don't necessarily believe everything you do. But it's nice when you can come to an agreement. So that's what we have to hope that people eventually in our country will do. Well, thank you very much for your attention tonight.